Dr. Sikkenga, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We'd like you to start with some opening comments, and then we'll go to questions.
Well, thank you very much, Kathy. It's a delight to be with you again. Delight to be with the panelists as well and your audience. It's just terrific to have a chance to really dig deep into the Constitution, as you all have been doing. What a wonderful way to celebrate Constitution Day, not just by marking the day, but by doing all the work that you all have done to prepare for that day and to have those kind of conversations. I think it's exactly the kind of thing our founders hoped for when they created the Constitution, because it really is true that it's been called the miracle at Philadelphia, that people could come together in the heat of the summer of 1787 and actually produce the document that gets produced. James Madison says in the Federalist Papers, a pious person would see the hand of divine providence in the fact that it got actually created. Despite all the differences among our founders and framers at the convention, it still produced an amazing document. But the founders really believed for the experiment in self-government in America to succeed, the piece of paper wasn't going to be enough. That the principles of the Constitution on which the document is founded, that really the piece of paper gives life to and articulates, those principles have to be in the hearts and minds of Americans. Every generation, the founders knew, had to learn and relearn those principles that animate the Constitution and that give life and breadth to the text that they wrote. And so that's why it's so important for your organization, I really think, to be doing what it's doing, which is reanimating those principles, relearning those, especially among young people, because obviously that's the future generations. And that's exactly what our founders wanted. And unfortunately, it's not as common as it should be today. We really do have a crisis in civic education, in people's understanding of our shared American history and of those fundamental founding and constitutional principles. Some people out there may know about the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's called the Nape Test, and it's given every 4 years. And it was given last in American history and civics in 2018. And the scores are pretty alarming. They have basic, proficient, and advanced. And the proficient scores was given to 8th graders across the country. Only 24% of them scored proficient in U.S. government and civics. That means 3 out of every 4 were not proficient. And even worse, only 15% scored proficient in American history. That means we've got a lot of people out there who don't know or understand our founding principles deeply enough and don't have a strong sense of our shared history as a country. It's a real crisis, I think. You know, how Benjamin Franklin was asked coming out of the Constitutional Convention, you know, what government have you given us, Dr. Franklin? And he famously replied, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." You can't keep a republic if you don't know what one is. So the ignorance of basic facts, historical and constitutional facts and principles is alarming. And I think maybe even more deeply, there's a lack of understanding of the principles and why they're important. What makes America an exceptional country, and what are these principles that animate us? And so I think we not only have a crisis of facts and information, but also in many ways, a crisis of understanding and devotion. Because the American founders understood that patriotism in America, love of country, is not instinctual. It's not just born into you. It's the product of understanding why America deserves your respect, why you should love the country. It requires understanding why the country is lovable in order to love it. So it means every generation has to be renewed in its understanding so it can be renewed in its attachment to our country. And when you hear those kind of numbers, to me, that's very alarming. That's why I think the work of Constituting America is so important. It's why the work that I think we're doing at Ashbrook is so important, because we really need to reach the youngest, everybody, but in particular, the youngest generations with the story of America. It's a great story. It's a complex story. It has heroes and villains. It has arguments and struggles and conflicts. It has failures, but it also has successes, great triumphs, and great moments that I think we all really need to get to know, including those that are in our Constitution itself. So that's really what animates Ashbrook and our mission, to educate our fellow Americans in that. And I know that's also what animates Constituting America and your panelists. And I just think it's a crisis that we really need to address. Math is important. Science is important. It's really true. People need to study those and be literate in those, for example. But it's also true that not everybody's going to be a mathematician their whole life. Not everybody's going to be a scientist their whole life. Everybody is going to be a citizen their whole life. They need to understand the principles of the country that they are a citizen of. And that's why I just think that's the work of America's history teachers, of America's government teachers, of America's civics teachers, is really the most important work that's going on in American education today. And unfortunately, too often overlooked and underappreciated, but critical for our country.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to get to Tova and Jewel and Joran in just a minute. But, Ashbrook does do such wonderful work. And I know y'all have got a great program teaching American history. And I was wondering if you could tell us just a little bit about that, about your teaching American history program.
Sure. Yeah, we really realize that if you want to reach students, one great way to do it is through their teachers. So we run programs around the country. We go to school districts. And we partner with school districts, with historical sites, with public museums, public libraries, and we run professional development seminars for teachers in the Constitution, in the Declaration of Independence, in the great primary sources of American history from the founding all the way really to the present. And we found that the teachers love those. They get a chance to really dig deep into the stuff that they're teaching, and they can go back into the classroom with a really renewed knowledge and confidence to be able to teach those texts. A lot of teachers in states out there have to teach primary sources, but they haven't always had the opportunity to get the education in those sources that really enable them to bring them alive in their classrooms. So that's what we're doing with our Teaching American History programs. And we actually have a website for that, tah.org, that people can go and take a look at. Terrific resource for teachers, American history teachers, government, and civics teachers.
Great. Thank you so much. Y'all really do wonderful work. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Tova now. And Tova, I'm sure you've got some questions.
Thanks so much, Kathy. So yeah, that was a great summary. I just had a few questions. First, the U.S. Constitution is known as the world's oldest and shortest written constitution. So first of all, why make it short? Wouldn't you think longer is better, more, laying out more things? So why do you think the founders made the Constitution short compared to other constitutions that came later? And do you think the brevity is related to the longevity?
I think that's a great question. It's a model of legislation, which we don't always follow these days, as you just said, Tova. Yeah, why so short? Because the founders understood that they were framing a government and they were laying out the architecture of a national government with the Constitution. They knew that Congress, the president, and the courts would fill a lot of it in. And so they understood that the work of generations following them would be to fill in much of the content of passing legislation, enforcing laws, making judicial decisions, that it didn't all have to be laid out all at once, because it was an experiment in Republican self-government, and they knew that that government was going to happen over the course of generations. I also think, look, it was a compromise. Delegates from all kinds of different places came. Some issues were simply not going to get settled. One of the most contentious, and one that we think about today a lot historically, is the issue of slavery. The issue of slavery was simply not going to be able to be decided on a national basis at that convention in Philadelphia. So there's some issues that were just sort of addressed only on the margins and not in great depth because of the necessity really of compromise in order to get a document that could go out to the states and be ratified by the people in the states. So I think it's both their understanding of what a constitution would do and the challenges they've faced in framing a constitution.
Interesting. And how much do you think the founding fathers anticipated that the Constitution would change? Like, obviously, we've talked a bit before in past sessions about the amendment process. The Constitution has been amended a number of times, but judging by the fact that it's the world's oldest Constitution, one could argue that it also is fundamentally the same. So when the founders created the Constitution with like the amendment process built in, how much do you think that they might have anticipated it would change?
That's a great question. I think, just to take two founding friends, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, they really had a difference of opinion. They agreed on almost everything. In fact, there's even a Madison room in Monticello. Madison was such a regular, frequent guest there. But on this issue, they really disagreed. Thomas Jefferson famously said that at least the Constitution of Virginia should change every generation, every 19 or 20 years. There should be that kind of change. James Madison in Federalist number 49, one of the very few times he publicly breaks with Thomas Jefferson and says, he calls him the author of the Notes on the State of Virginia. You don't want to refer to him directly, but that was Thomas Jefferson's famous book. He said, it's an ingenious idea, but I don't think it's the right idea, because we need to have a constitution that people have some reverence for, some attachment to, which means we shouldn't be changing it all the time. Madison thought they got it fundamentally right in Philadelphia on many of the main issues, although he didn't agree with everything that was there. But he thought what was really important was that the people came to live with the Constitution and really make the Constitution part of themselves, so that that became part of the American identity to be constitutional and to be attached to the Constitution. And that's exactly the thing that George Washington says in his farewell address: cherish the Constitution and the union of the states that the Constitution has brought about. So I think that people like James Madison knew there would have to be changes. After all, he introduced the Bill of Rights. There's 12 changes originally proposed by James Madison, right? So he knew there was going to be changes. He certainly supported the idea of changes, but he thought that the changes had to be the product of real deliberation, reflection, and choice, as Alexander Hamilton put it in the Federalist number 1. And that shouldn't be easy to do. And so I think that he realized if you change it too much, you're going to start to weaken people's attachment to the Constitution itself. So it should be open to change, but only change that really significant majorities of the country really want, and across the whole country. And then those can be enacted. And that's what we've got when we have 27 amendments. We've only had 17 really since the Bill of Rights.
Yeah, thank you. That's very interesting. And then another question I had is I once saw a play called, I think it was called What the Constitution Means to Me or something like that. And at the end, the play ended in a very interesting way with a debate about whether we should keep our Constitution or create a new Constitution, which to me was very interesting because, I mean, I work at Constituting America. I spend a lot of time thinking about the US Constitution. I wasn't even in my mind to debate about whether we should have a new constitution or whatever. So I think I can imagine what side of the debate you are on, but can you provide, like, if you were on that stage in that debate, like, can you provide a justification as to why we should keep our constitution, why it has relevance, and maybe to some people that would debate, oh, we need to create a new constitution that's relevant, more relevant for us now. What would you say to that?
I would say we've been incredibly blessed as a country and prospered as a country under the Constitution that we have. And I think one of the proof is in the pudding. The American Union has really flourished. In part, George Washington thought it, Abraham Lincoln thought it, and other famous Americans thought we owe our prosperity in many ways to the Constitution that the founders gave us and to the principles underlying the Constitution. So I would say, look, we've gotten it right. And when we didn't get it right, it's been amended in order to get it right. And I think that's an extraordinarily rare thing. I think one of the things we have to remind ourselves is, as you said, it's the oldest constitution in the world. There are a lot of countries that are pretty old, but they don't have stable written constitutions. That's a very rare thing that we take for granted because we've lived under the Constitution for so long. And so I would say the fact that it works And when it hasn't worked, we've been able to amend it to make it work. And it embodies certain fundamental principles of justice, of right and wrong, that we get from documents like the Declaration of Independence and the principles of the American founding that the founders thought really are true. And they're true in 1776. They're true in 1863. They're true in 2022. And if that's true, and the Constitution embodies those, we should be really careful about changing it. And we should only change it when we're really sure that the Constitution itself is not quite living up to its own principles. And then we can change it, as we have, for example, in extending the right to vote.
That's a great point. And then for my last question, I was sort of thinking about the point you were making about how, how little knowledge there is about the US Constitution among America's youth. And obviously that's a very troubling statistic and situation. And having come, I am not too far out of school myself. I obviously was lucky enough to be really interested in that. But I definitely saw a lot of my peers. It just didn't really click with them. I think so why do you think that this is? Like, why do you think this situation exists that a lot of students don't know much about the Constitution, especially because I know in Illinois, and I'm sure many other states, it's a requirement to be taught about it. But I think the way it's taught, students, it just doesn't stick with students, and they don't get a lot out of that curriculum. Obviously, with Constituting America, we try to remedy that with your organization. But what do you think is being done wrong? Like, what can be done to remedy this? What's your opinion?
That's a really great question. I always think about, if anybody out there had a great class in American history or in American civics, what made that a great class? You had a teacher who really knew their subject. You had a teacher who really loved their subject. And you had a teacher who really just loved teaching the students. And that love, that enthusiasm just came out into the classroom. I think that's really critical. It's the character of the teacher. And then the idea, understanding that really this is about us. It's about the story of America. And we're part of that story. And all kids, people of all ages, but especially younger people, love stories. They love to connect to stories and to see America as an unfolding story. And the way I think of it is as an unfolding story of freedom and the principles of the founding being applied more and more as we go forward in our struggle in American history. To see that and to immerse yourself in that, in the primary documents themselves. I really think that's true. I'm not a big fan of textbooks. It's really hard to write textbooks. Even professors who know this stuff really well, it's really hard to write textbooks that convey the story in all its liveliness, in all its complexity, in all its humanity, in all of its interest. There's nothing like going back and reading the original documents and just cracking open the Constitution and sitting around and talking about it. Say, what does this mean? Right? That's I think, a great way to do it. And when you get in a classroom like that, you really feel that it's alive. And we've seen it. We run programs for high school students here at Ashbrook called the Ashbrook Academy. We bring students in from across the country, and that's what we do. We just start with the first line and read through it. And it's kind of amazing the conversations we end up having. You all have experienced that with your series here. It's just that conversation about the text itself and what it means, and asking those questions and thinking them through together. I think it just brings it alive as part of the story that we have to tell. So I would say we have to tell the story and get students immersed in the story and understand that the story is about them as Americans and what it means to be an American.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I will now pass along to Jewel and Jorn, but thank you very much.
Well, thank you. So far, it's such an important discussion, of course, for Constituting America. So I'm glad we have someone like you on to talk about it. At the beginning of the show, you probably heard that my brother and I and my family do theater. So stories is pretty much a piece of everything that we do. And I 100% agree in every way with what you said about stories and the Constitution. I think that when we saw Hamilton take the world by storm, it definitely showed people that our founding story is remarkable and that it is something that can be connected with across generations of any spectrum. What I wonder is by definition, in one way, we're all conservatives because we want to conserve the Constitution, no matter how much we think it's could be imperfect, could be improved, or that we imperfectly enact it because we are imperfect. Whatever, wherever we fall in the spectrum, in one way or another, we do believe in the value of this Constitution. And on that side of people who believe in the value of the Constitution, what I've experienced often is factionalism, basically, that because we have this, we don't always agree on everything, and because we're building something, it's often harder to build something with people you don't agree with on everything than it is to destroy something. So those who want to destroy the Constitution, if you don't agree with the person trying to burn the thing down, it doesn't matter as much because you're trying to destroy something, in my experience. So I wonder, what has your experience been on working through the differences on the side of those who believe in the value of the Constitution?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. My experience has been better always to start with where we agree than where we disagree. So if we can start by saying, hey, we value the Constitution. So for example, we value the First Amendment, freedom of speech. Let's start by saying understanding what that means and understand the common ground that we share in embracing that. And then we can start disagreeing with a particular Supreme Court decision, for example, on what freedom of speech means in that particular case. So I always say, let's resort back to fundamental principles that anybody who respects the Constitution, look, if you believe in the Constitution like you do and like I do, like our organization does, like Constituting America does, there are certain fundamental principles that I think that really all Americans can embrace, like equal treatment before the law, individual liberty, consent of the governed, limited constitutional government. Those are all basic founding principles that animate our Constitution, and having a republic where the people have a voice through their representatives in government. Those are all really fundamental principles. And I think we could start arguing about what they mean in particular situations, but we shouldn't lose sight through that argument of the fact that we're agreeing actually on the foundational principles. And I think it's our task as those who support the Constitution and want people to understand it and strengthen its understanding in people's hearts and minds, to keep going back to those first principles, to keep saying, here's the why of the Constitution. Tova asked the question before about, how can we better teach the Constitution? It's really important to know what the Constitution says. But I think a lot of students often say, why do I care about this? How is it relevant? I think you have to understand the why of the Constitution in order to really absorb the what of the Constitution. So I think if we resort back to those fundamental principles, like, hey, don't we all agree on equal treatment before the law? Don't we all agree on individual liberty? Don't we all agree on consent of the governed? Don't we all agree on limited constitutional government and the rule of law? Aren't those all important to us? I think we can make a lot of progress even while we have differences and disagreements, because then we're really disagreeing and we understand that we're disagreeing kind of within a family, within a community who agree on those fundamental things. You and your brother probably never disagree, but if you did, at least you share a certain common understanding that is the basis of that disagreement.
Yes, exactly. And I think that, so just to go further into that question, another thing I've seen that I've experienced is sometimes we get lost on this side of the people who are invested in the Constitution, may get lost in the details or get lost in the details of how something's going to be done. Let's say how a program is going to be run or how this is going to be done, and don't always put as much sometimes we get lost in the forest from the trees, which may just be the personality types of people who are interested in reading, Constitution in the first place. Have you experienced any of that, and have you been able to get through some of it when you're doing your important work?
Yeah, that's a good question. We have, when we go back to the forest, I really think it's important to start with the forest, with those big principles and the why questions, then kind of plunge into the trees and study the what of things, but then go back to the why and the big picture, so that you're always kind of moving between the forest and the trees. And I think when you do that, a lot of those disagreements start to clear up, or at least it becomes clearer what you're actually disagreeing about. Oh, you disagree with this Supreme Court decision. You don't believe in freedom of speech. Like, wait a minute. No, I just think that's not quite what I think freedom of speech means. Oh, why not? And then we have a conversation about what we think freedom of speech means. And we realize, oh, okay, I see why you have that opinion. And then maybe I still disagree with you, but at least I understand why you hold that view based on your understanding of what freedom of speech means. See, I think when you kind of have that kind of conversation, you can end up, even if you disagree, you don't have to be disagreeable, right? And you can kind of end up understanding why there is that disagreement. And just that act builds trust among people and among citizens, and builds conversation.
I think that the story of the concept of principles itself, of the rights that the Constitution's enshrining, let's say, or recognizing as natural law, that the story of these things that are inalienable is an amazing concept, but it's hard for students to engage with it, because the concept of inalienable rights is not as inherent in us anymore, as certain belief structures have broken down. As not many people go to church every Sunday and these things. But I think when you've come back to saying, we should start with the big principles. That's 100% what I think we think here as well too. One difficult thing though is when it's hard to talk about what a principle is. So have you had those discussions with students?
That's a good question. Yeah, you're right. What do you do if you've got people, you're not even sure you agree on first principles, right? I always think you start with a conversation of something like, hey, do you think it'd be a good idea? Would you want to be imprisoned arbitrarily without being charged or convicted in a court? And someone says, no, of course, that's a terrible idea. Say, okay, I wouldn't either. Why not? Oh, okay, because there's some things called due process of law that we're all supposed to have. Okay, how come we are supposed to have due process of law? And then you sort of move backwards, right? I always say, go to people and right where they are and ask them that kind of question. And they'll say, no, I don't want my freedom of speech suppressed, or I don't want to be put in jail arbitrarily. And then you can kind of work back to say, oh yeah, because there's a principle at work there. Due process of law. Where do we find that? Oh, we find it in the Constitution. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. And then that leads us back to the principles and then to the text of the Constitution itself. So I always it shouldn't start out abstract. I really think it should start out immediate and personal with students. I teach the Fourth Amendment a lot, which is on unreasonable searches and seizures. Students love that. But I always make sure we start with cases that are right connected to them, like search and seizure in school or something. But then we start peeling it back and moving back toward the bigger principles. And then they begin to see, even if they're disagreeing on something, they are embracing the same principle actually. And they do think that's the right principle. But I don't think you can start with that argument. I think you got to start with people where they are.
I think this is great stuff for us to hear, and I think our entire audience is probably benefiting a lot from it, since many of us have a love for the Constitution, but we do run into all of these issues that you've worked through and that we work through here on Constituting America too. Another thing, slightly different, like totally different track here. If you're using your imagination, what would, if you had to think of the next amendment for the Constitution, what do you think we could use right now?
Wow, that's a really big question. Do you mean what I think is most likely or what I would recommend?
No, what you would recommend.
Ooh, that's a hard one. First of all, I'm with James Madison. I don't like too many constitutional amendments. So, and there's all kinds of scholars. I'm a political scientist. A lot of political science have long lists of constitutional amendments. I'm in general not in favor of constitutional amendments. I mean, if you think of prohibition, for example, right? I think that was a huge mistake. And we know it was a big mistake because it didn't work, and then it actually got repealed by a constitutional amendment, right? Overturning a previous constitutional amendment. And there's a reason for that, because I think those are issues of public policy on which reasonable people of goodwill can disagree, and those things need to be settled in the legislatures in Congress. They need to be settled in the state legislatures, and they need to be settled at the local level and through public opinion, and through people's argument and debate and discussion and deliberation. I think we sometimes like to make the Constitution try and solve every problem. It's not meant to do that. What it's meant to do is create a framework and principles of justice within which we operate and deliberate and solve those problems. And that's going to change. So in 1919, people think alcohol should be banned. In 1933, they think it shouldn't be banned. That's not a constitutional issue. That's a public policy issue, and the Constitution should leave that to the people and their representatives to solve that. So I'm really reluctant to propose like substantive constitutional amendments. In fact, most of the really good constitutional amendments have been just extending the principles of the Constitution to more people. Think of the 13th Amendment and abolishing slavery. Think of the extension of the right to vote to people regardless of their sex. So women's suffrage, like those have been important, but they're structural issues. They're not public policy issues. I don't think the Constitution is meant to handle that. And it becomes very divisive in the country when we try to do that. So my basic view is I don't want to recommend any constitutional amendments except those that might improve the Constitution's operation. But I actually think it does pretty well for itself.
Well, it's a very informative answer, even though I was just what I'm looking for when I'm trying to ask these things.
I understand. I understand.
Yeah, it's not always just answering it on face value. It's us at the show trying to figure out, trying to learn something actually. So thank you. Jordan, you have a couple of questions?
Yeah. So I'd like to bring it down to the youth a little bit. And, it's very hard to get kids interested in really anything that isn't a screen. So if you were to try to say, let's say a fifth grader, you want to get a fifth grader interested in the Constitution, not to, learn it all right now, but to spark it so that they'll be more open to it and push them to learn about it as they mature. How would you do that?
Wow, that's a great question, because my daughter's a fifth grader. So it's something I think about actually. I go back to the point I made before. I think you need to tell the story of the Constitution. I think it needs to be brought down to the level of kids in fifth grade, and they need to be part of that story. They need to meet the amazing people who are there. Who's Benjamin Franklin and what's he all about? Who's George Washington? Who's James Madison, this little short guy? Why is he so important, right? And to get there, that's why Ashbrook is actually right now developing a K-5 curriculum in the Constitution and the founding principles, because we really think you got to connect it to students at that age through that kind of story that they'll grasp and is relevant to them. And then they can start asking questions like, why do you think why did we even need a Constitution? What's good about a Constitution? And then you can make examples of, well, what if you had a classroom without any rules? What would that be like? And they might be like, that'd be great. That'd be cool. And then, 2 minutes later, like, wait a minute. No, maybe not. Okay. Right. And so you can kind of connect it to the place, the space they live in. But I think you have to start with kids love stories with heroes and villains. And the Constitution has a lot of great stories with heroes and villains.
Do you think there is, well, you're working on your curriculum, so that could be what I use in the future, but what would you use right now if you had to use something? It can't be you teaching it. if you had to use a source, what source?
Ooh, good question. I would say wait about 6 months and our curriculum will be out. But, look, there are some really good books out there. It is kind of interesting, though, that again, the approach so far that's been used in a lot of K-5 situations is textbooks, which I think are good, but they're not as good as, like, I would use excerpts from people's diaries. And make sure the teacher, of course, understands what those are. So, or here's a letter from George Washington to his wife about the Constitutional Convention, or whatever. I would use those kind of primary documents that can be kind of boiled down for kids that age, so they can see that, hey, George Washington's a real person. And he's actually worried about real stuff when he's at the Constitutional Convention. Or they have him read a little bit of the debates in the convention. I think a fifth grader can do that. I think my daughter could do that and see that, oh, wait a minute, they all didn't just agree, they were arguing with each other. That's pretty interesting. And especially if you have a teacher that can really help explain in their understanding what they're arguing about and why it's really important. So I would say try and find those kind of primary resources that teachers can then kind of take and translate into that grade level. That's the project we're doing right now, as I said. But, like I mentioned, teachingamericanhistory.org, that's our website for teachers. It's the largest online collection of primary source documents for teachers in the country. We've got over 3,000 of them. So teachers and we have teachers using them from fourth grade, like all the way up to high school. So they can go on there and find those. So I'd recommend that. And then there are other good readers out there to look at. There are some good textbooks too, but I always think it's best, if possible, to go back to the primary sources themselves. And you can really start with kids as early as second, third, fourth grade, in fact, as long as you do it, age appropriate, but get them back into the story themselves.
Great. When I look at our founding, I was always drawn to a person. I was always drawn to George Washington. It's just kind of, he was my guy. That was the one I'd always look to, and I would follow it. I would follow the founding, almost through his eyes, if that makes sense to you. So, who was yours? Who is your main player?
Oh, that's a great question. First of all, I think that's terrific that you had that. I always ask my students, I always tell my students, college students, I say to them, look, one thing I hope you get from this class is that you'll find a hero in American history. I really think it's important for us to find a hero, whether it's Susan B. Anthony, whether it's Frederick Douglass. I mean, those are my personal heroes, for example, in American life, whether it's Abraham Lincoln, or whether it's a person who fought in the Revolutionary War as an ordinary soldier. Like, there's so many great American stories from all people of all kinds of backgrounds and historical periods, that to find one like you did, George Washington, and see the story through their eyes is absolutely the right way to go. And then you start to learn everything about Washington. And, a guy like Washington, the more you get to know him as a human being, and even when you see his flaws, the more impressive he actually is. And true heroes are like that. The more you humanize them, the more impressive they become, right? So for me personally, I think it's James Madison. Maybe that's because I'm a political scientist and he was kind of the most political science-y of the founders. But the profound, deep thinking that Madison engaged in, there's a reason why he's called the father of the Constitution, because he really thought through things at a level that even some of the other folks who came to the convention did not really think through as deeply as he did. I mean, that's what Thomas Jefferson thought. That's what, as you know, George Washington thought. They're like, Madison is the brains of the operation. He really thought deeply through those things. It doesn't mean that the others weren't important. Everybody made a contribution. Without George Washington, it's not clear the Constitution would ever have been put together or adopted, ratified, right? Because of his enormous integrity and reputation. So there's it took all those people together, but my personal hero is for his depth of thinking and the courage to actually put that forward was James Madison.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I think it's time for some audience questions. I know we got a ton.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. This has been really a great episode. And before we get to the audience questions, I just want to recognize some of the students and teachers that are on with us today. We've got Terry Zalesnik with homeschool students on, Sherry Stiegel with homeschool students on, and Kathleen Hurley with 41 students from Genesee School on. So we want to welcome all of those great students who are watching. And I think, first I want to make a couple of comments about some things that we've already talked about. When you mentioned how important it is teaching students via stories, I just, Constituting America would probably not have even been founded if our founder, the actress Janine Turner, had not had the assignment in her 5th grade class of the musical 1776. And she had a teacher, James Ingram, who put this show on. And Janine fell in love with the founders through that musical. And again, I think that's, what we do at Constituting America is so important. We allow kids to express themselves through the arts and by creating songs and short films and public service announcements, because it really is a way, when you move someone's heart, you move their mind. So I think that was a really great point. And then another, when Jewel and Jorn mentioned what resource would you use, I'm just going to ask Aubrey. I couldn't help myself to throw up this book on the screen. Our Constitution Rocks is a great resource for anybody who is looking for a resource to teach your kids. It's written by Juliet Turner, who is on our board and is our former National Youth Director. And it's published by HarperCollins Zondervan, and it goes through the Constitution article by article and clause, Article 1, Section 1, Clause 1, all the way through the 27th Amendment. And everyone has sections like, what were they thinking? What does this mean to me? Why should I care? So it's a really great resource as well. But so as far as our questions go, Sandy Thatcher has a really great question asking, would it be fair to say that Madison was an originalist while Jefferson was an exponent of the living Constitution? And I was wondering, could you not only answer Sandy's question, but just talk a little bit about this whole concept of originalism versus the living Constitution?
Sure. It's really two basic approaches to how the Constitution should be interpreted. Should you interpret it according to what it originally was understood to mean? That's originalism. Or should you interpret it according to how the meaning of the words today, not necessarily what they meant in 1787? And there's really two different schools. And then there's a lot of mixing in between those, of course, and among justices and judges and public officials. James Madison was certainly an originalist. He actually said that he thought the meaning of the Constitution was what it was understood by the people who ratified it. Because James Madison believed very powerfully that the Constitution's authority really did come from we the people. And therefore, we the people's understanding of the Constitution is what the Constitution means until we change it. So he himself was an originalist. He said that in letters and in documents. So we know that. Thomas Jefferson's a more complex story, probably, because I think Thomas Jefferson was an originalist in the sense that he thought the Constitution should be interpreted as it was originally understood, but that every generation had the right to change it and adopt a new Constitution. Calling for a convention, for example. And in fact, I'm in the state of Ohio right now. In the state of Ohio, actually, every 20 years, the Constitution requires that the voters decide whether to get rid of the Constitution and call a constitutional convention and change it. We adopted Thomas Jefferson's principle, actually. So I think Thomas Jefferson was an originalist while that Constitution existed, but that he thought that every generation should then readopt or create its own Constitution.
Well, and speaking of creating your own Constitution, Gary Porter writes, one way to make the Constitution more relevant to students is use of a classroom Constitution, which they contribute to drafting and ratifying. This concept is often employed from first grade onward in Christian schools, which use the principal approach method of education. So that's really interesting. Now, Robert Zimmerman is going back to our discussion a few minutes ago on amendments and Robert says, propose an amendment that limits executive powers. What would you think about that?
Well, my own view is that the legislature, Congress, for example, has delegated way too much authority to the executive branch. I really think we have executive agencies that are making legal rules with a lot of discretion, that Congress really should take back that authority, and that the people should be governed by laws made by their representatives, not by bureaucracies and administrative agencies. I believe that pretty strongly, and I think that's an issue on which all sides of the political spectrum in many ways should be able to agree. I wish we didn't have to have a constitutional amendment to do that, though. I wish Congress would take back its rightful authority under the Constitution for itself to do that. And that really just requires courage in Congress to do that. And then we'll end up with laws. Maybe that would be clearer. Maybe that would be more carefully thought through and written, because they really would matter. They wouldn't just write a general law and then delegate a lot of authority to the executive agencies to actually create the rules. I don't like that. I think that's not really self-government in the way that our founders understood it.
Well, thank you. And then Nancy asked if you could explain to our listeners why Articles 1, 2, and 3 are in the order that they're in the Constitution. Did the founders just draw them out of a hat? And
that's a good question. Well, it's not the order that they were debated at the Constitutional Convention. So we know that because we have James Madison's records of the Constitutional Convention of the debates. I think it's the order of importance. Really, they really thought the legislative branch was and should be the most important in a republic because it's closest to the people, and of course the Senate closest to the states. And then the executive branch in enforcing the law is really important because you can have law, but if it's not enforced, it's not meaningful. But then, of course, the judicial branch, they really thought would probably be, Alexander Hamilton calls it in Federalist 78, the least dangerous branch, the least powerful branch, because he said Congress has the purse, the executive has the sword. So I really think that we see the order of importance in those three articles.
thank you. And then Mark Hill has got some comments. He says, agree completely that we need to do a better job of teaching our youth about the very documents that define the American way of life. Even more important, we need to teach them what was in the founding fathers' minds when they wrote them. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, and the wonderful thing is we have access to a lot of their writings. We have access to their public writings in the Federalist Papers, for example, in explaining and defending the Constitution. And those should be a part of everybody's curriculum, college, but I think you can also study those in high school and middle school. There's some great things in there that really, if you read them, you're like, oh, that's what the Constitution is supposed to mean. I get it. And you could pair it with an anti-federalist argument and put the two together in dispute. I think that's a terrific way. I know even Constituting America has done that before. I think that's absolutely the right way to go about it.
Well, and one interesting thing that we're doing with Constituting America is we have book clubs, and our current book is the book that Professor Gordon Lloyd edited, which is James Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention. And I encourage all of our audience members to sign up and join us on Thursday, September 22nd, that in the evening, 7 p.m. Eastern, we're going to be going through part 2 of that book with Professor Lloyd. And to me, it is just fascinating to be able to read James Madison's actual notes. And you're right, it is also very interesting that they did not debate these articles in order at the Constitutional Convention. And some of them they had to keep going back to time and time again because they couldn't agree. So they would table it and they'd say, okay, we're going to come back to it later, which is also really interesting. So I know we only have 3 minutes left. Aubrey's holding up a sign. Hector Sandoval says, why is there so little required of our congressmen and women to know and follow and protect the Constitution? And then how can we make the leaders in government accountable to follow the Constitution and have consequences or penalties for straying from the meaning and purpose of this great document?
Wow, that's a terrific question. I would love it if every member of Congress had to take a test on their constitutional knowledge when they came into office. I think that would be terrific. If you're going to swear to uphold the Constitution, you should probably know what's in it. The other thing I think is, look, it's up to us, we the people. It's up to us to hold our elected officials accountable for the constitutionality of their actions. And I think that's something that really troubles me today when we hear a lot about, well, we'll let the courts sort out all the constitutional issues. I think that is an abrogation of our own duty as citizens to know what's in the Constitution and to say, above all, whether I agree or disagree, like it or don't like it, above all, the question is this constitutional? That's really the first question. And then we can get into, okay, if it's constitutional, should we do it? But we can't do it if it isn't constitutional. That means we have to understand the Constitution, and we actually have to voice our opinions about it, and we even have to vote on that basis. And I think if we did that, public officials would be much more likely to be careful about the Constitution.
Definitely. And those are great points. And, I thought we would just close with one of my favorite quotes from George Washington, which is, "A primary object should be the education of our youth in the science of government. In a republic, what species of knowledge can be equally important, and what duty more pressing than communicating it to those who are to be the future guardians of the liberties of the country?" And to me, it's just fascinating that George Washington would recognize the importance of educating the youth at that time in our country's history. Do you have any final comments on that, and on any other thoughts that you know of that the founders were thinking of as far as the importance of educating our youth?
Yeah, it was on Washington's mind all the time, Kathy, which, as you say, is kind of amazing, given everything else that was on his mind. But he really knew that for our experiment in self-government to succeed, every generation had to learn these principles again. They had to learn the text of the Constitution, they had to learn the meaning of the Constitution, and then they had to live it out in their lives. He said that in his farewell address. He was absolutely certain. He went so far as to propose a national university where people could come and actually learn the science of politics, the principles of the Constitution. He was profoundly committed to that because he knew that's the only way that it really works, is if we, the people, have those principles in our hearts and minds, including in the youngest generations. That's the only way the experiment will work. And I really think we owe it to our founders, but also we really owe it to ourselves to continue that experiment by being educated and educating ourselves in the Constitution and its principles. It's a remarkable country that we've been blessed to have. It's up to us to keep it going.
Exactly. And thank you to Ashbrook for everything that you all do to educate citizens and teachers and students about the U.S. Constitution. And you yourself and professors, Chris Burkett and others associated with Ashbrook, Professor Gordon Lloyd, you all have been so helpful to Constituting America with so many of our programs. And we just thank you for your time today and for all of your great insights. And Jewel and Jorn, would you like to say anything in closing?
Just happy Constitution Day, everybody, coming up, and thanks for being part of this series. And thank you, Professor, for being here, or Doctor, I'm trying to remember which one it is now. But thank you for everything that you do.
Yes, thank you for a fantastic show today, answering all the questions. It was a great time.
Yeah. Happy Constitution Day, everybody. And please join us on Friday, September 16th. We hope to see you there. Thank you.